Throughout the years of American slavery, from the early colonial era through the antebellum South, some plantation owners orchestrated brutal fights between enslaved people. These staged bouts were organized spectacles, forced, controlled, and used as tools of dominance, coercion, and entertainment. The earliest records appear in Virginia tobacco plantations in the 1700s. Overseers pitted men against one another under the guise of resolving disputes or showcasing strength. As tobacco gave way to rice in South Carolina, cotton in Georgia, and sugar in Louisiana, the practice spread. By the early 1800s, it was a known occurrence across the southern states. Plantation sports, horse races, wrestling, and these fights, converged on weekends or market days. Enslavers viewed these matches as demonstrations of control. Enslaved fighters were selected, often due to youth, physical resilience, or outspokenness. Their opponents were chosen deliberately, a rival, a friend, or someone who challenged authority. These men were forced into a makeshift ring, marked in dirt or wood, with overseers or owners enforcing the rules. There were no referees to ensure fair play, no medical assistance. The result, humiliation under threat of more punishment. One plantation diary from Louisiana, circa 1825, records how spectators bet on the outcome, placing coins on names. Another account from Mississippi, circa 1840, mentions that women were occasionally drawn into fights to settle supposed quarrels. Fights were presented as entertainment, but also intended to instill fear. They served as stark, public reminders: this is your place. Defiance carries risk. These spectacles occurred at different scales, from small farmyards to cleared fields near the big house. Sometimes, local white families would gather as spectators. Mechanics and traders would join in for wagers. Riders from neighboring farms heard the challenge bell at a distance and rode in to watch. Despite its prevalence, enslaved people resisted the dehumanizing logic of these fights. Fighters sometimes held back during matches, feigning compliance while avoiding serious harm. Others communicated solidarity with subtle gestures, a nod, a shared glance, a silent pause at a critical moment. Challenges to the system appeared in other forms too. Some families refused to allow relatives to participate. Some escaped before being selected. Occasionally an overseer was fired for cruelty that even other enslavers found excessive. In rare cases, fights were disallowed by church meetings or local law, but enforcement was inconsistent. By mid-19th century, exposed footage and abolitionist accounts began to highlight the barbaric nature of these spectacles. Abolitionist newspapers like The Liberator published testimonies and illustrations. Slave narratives also mentioned the forced violence. Henry Bibb recalled being forced into a ring as a young teen, nearly beaten to death. These dark stories circulated in pamphlets and underground networks. Though these staged fights never defined American slavery, they reveal its brutal core: human beings turned into objects of spectacle, performance, gambling, and control. Yet, even inside the ring, enslaved people found ways to claim agency, to resist invisibly, and to remember their own humanity. As the 19th century progressed, these brutal spectacles became more frequent and more structured across the southern United States. Slave fights were no longer just impromptu punishments or plantation pastimes. They became planned events, often scheduled alongside harvest celebrations, horse races, or county fairs. Some were even publicized through word of mouth among neighboring plantations and rural towns. The practice took on various forms depending on the region. In Georgia and Alabama, fights often occurred at the back of large cotton fields near barns or overseers' quarters. In Louisiana and Mississippi, wooden platforms were erected specifically for matches during gatherings. These platforms were sometimes elevated with wooden steps, providing a clear view for white audiences seated on makeshift benches. The enslaved participants had no say. Selected by overseers or owners, often for their physical condition or as a form of punishment, they were trained in rudimentary fighting methods, bare fists, wrestling holds, or simple brawling. No protection, no gloves, and no limits. Some were pitted against unfamiliar opponents from other plantations, increasing confusion and tension. Fights could last until one man fell unconscious or was no longer able to stand. Those who refused were often whipped or denied food. The message was clear: your body is not your own. Despite the cruelty, enslaved fighters developed covert systems of resistance. Some learned to pull punches without making it obvious. Others created prearranged signs with their opponent, eye contact, faint gestures, so they could make the match appear real without causing lasting harm. It was risky. But it was one of the few ways they could assert control over their bodies and dignity within a rigged system. Enslavers, however, took it further. Wagers became routine. Plantation owners bet property, tobacco, cotton, and sometimes even additional enslaved persons. These events became a grotesque economy. Enslaved people, reduced to numbers, outcomes, tools. A journal from 1838 belonging to a Tennessee planter recounts how he won 13-year-old boy after a particularly fine match, referring to it as a profitable Saturday. Another letter between two southern landowners discusses an upcoming match and the fine stock available for viewing. Women and children were sometimes forced to watch as warning. They stood at the edge of rings, clutching one another, told this was what happened to strong-willed men. These scenes created generational fear, powerful psychological control mechanisms passed down through silence and memory. And yet, enslaved communities never accepted these events as entertainment. They prayed, mourned, and comforted one another afterward. Songs were sung in code, spirituals that disguised grief as hope. Wade in the water, swing low, sweet chariot, these were not just hymns but shields, ways to pass meaning between hearts broken by violence. Plantation papers rarely described these events with remorse. But oral histories tell a different story, stories passed quietly in cabins and firesides, where children learned the names of those who refused to break, who fought but did not surrender their soul. As these brutal spectacles grew in popularity among white enslavers, so did their demand for better fighters. On many plantations, enslaved men were singled out early for their size, speed, or perceived aggression. These individuals were not just forced to labor in the fields, but also groomed, trained without consent, for combat in these staged battles. Training, however, was a cruel misnomer. There were no coaches, no safety, no real instruction, just beatings, enforced sparring, and relentless physical exertion. Overseers forced men to spar daily with others, often encouraging violence with food incentives or punishment avoidance. The training grounds were cleared patches of dirt behind barns or inside empty storage sheds. Matches occurred regardless of injuries or illness. In certain regions, particularly in parts of South Carolina and Louisiana, some enslavers went so far as to create makeshift fighting gyms, open spaces surrounded by wooden fencing where selected men were confined for hours. They were told to fight one another for rations or minimal privileges, sometimes as a twisted form of ranking. Those deemed strongest were later used for bigger matches. Enslaved individuals were not only denied agency, but their physical bodies were conditioned to serve as entertainment, often at the expense of their health and well-being. Some were starved before matches to make them more desperate. Others were beaten to provoke rage. A broken hand, a swollen jaw, or a dislocated shoulder was no excuse to skip a fight. Healing was a luxury rarely offered. Yet amid this horror, some enslaved men developed methods of survival. They memorized their opponent's patterns, learned how to fall without injury, or used quick takedowns that ended fights swiftly to avoid prolonged punishment. Older enslaved men, who had fought in their youth, secretly mentored younger ones, teaching them how to avoid permanent damage or how to feign weakness without raising suspicion. The mental toll was immense. Fights often occurred in front of crowds, with white children laughing and mimicking the blows, encouraged by adults. The act of being reduced to violent spectacle destroyed the inner dignity of many, but it never eradicated it entirely. In whispers and coded stories passed between families, the fighters were seen not as brutes, but survivors, men forced to do what they must to live another day. Women, too, bore the burden. Mothers watched sons leave for training, uncertain if they'd return unbroken. Wives and sisters nursed wounds in silence, praying the scars wouldn't mark them forever. Children learned early that violence was not just punishment, it was expected performance. And while plantation owners placed bets and bragged about their champions, enslaved communities quietly grieved. The fighters, once boys running between cabins, were now instruments in a game they never asked to play. Every win came with pain, every loss, potential death. There were no champions, only survivors. As word of these brutal matches spread across counties and states, plantation owners began organizing full fight nights. These were more than spontaneous brawls, they were events, scheduled in advance, sometimes drawing enslavers from miles around. Elaborate preparations were made. Wooden platforms were built, benches brought in, and refreshments provided for the white spectators. The enslaved had no such luxury. These events usually took place on weekends or during holidays, when enslavers sought amusement or wanted to impress guests. They boasted about their champion fighters, men they claimed were the strongest, fiercest, or most obedient in the ring. Some were even named like racehorses, stripped of their real names and dignity. The fights were announced with drums or shouting, and enslaved people were forced to attend, not as willing viewers, but as objects of fear, coercion, or silent support for those forced to fight. In the center of the ring, usually a worn patch of grass or a wooden platform, two men were pushed forward. The crowd gathered, the overseers stood by, and the violence began. The rules were few and brutal. Sometimes the fight lasted until one man was unconscious. Other times, a white host would raise a hand to pause or restart the fight, controlling the event like a cruel game master. Refusals to fight were met with beatings or worse. There was no option but to endure or fall. Spectators cheered, laughed, shouted bets. Women in fine dresses sat beneath canopies, sipping lemonade while enslaved men battered each other a few feet away. Children clapped or mimicked the fighters. For white guests, it was entertainment. For the enslaved, it was torment. Despite this, fighters developed quiet ways of resisting. Some exchanged silent nods before matches, agreeing to limit their blows or stage falls to avoid severe harm. These unspoken pacts were risky. If caught, punishment followed, but for many, they were acts of brotherhood and quiet defiance. At night, after the crowds left, wounded fighters were returned to their quarters, often untreated. Bruises, broken bones, or worse were commonplace. The pain was not just physical, it was the lingering shame, the isolation, the sense of being made less than human. Yet in those dark moments, many found support in their communities. A shared glance, a whispered prayer, or a careful bandage from an elder woman became acts of healing and resistance. These spectacles continued across the American South, from Georgia to Virginia, from Mississippi to the Carolinas. Each state had its own versions, but the cruelty remained the same. Enslaved men became forced performers in a nightmare of violence, watched and wagered on by the very people who owned them. The enslavers did not leave fighting to chance. On many plantations, men and sometimes teenage boys were trained, not in the way athletes are trained for skill or health, but as tools of spectacle and profit. Strength was not just natural, it was forced, cultivated, and weaponized. Overseers singled out those with larger frames, quicker reflexes, or visible endurance. Once marked, a man's path could change entirely, into the pit of brutal staged combat. These chosen fighters were often given slightly more food or allowed longer rest, not out of compassion, but to keep them in peak condition. The overseers would watch them work, yell commands, and even pit them against each other in practice. In many ways, their lives became a warped version of training camp, with none of the freedom or dignity of sport. But the psychological toll was immense. Some enslaved men were praised for putting on a good show, while others were mocked or punished for holding back. There was no real victory, just survival. Some enslavers even used fighters as intimidation, bringing them before other enslaved people, claiming that, "This is what happens to the weak," or, "This one obeys because he knows his place." This exploitation varied by region. In Louisiana, some slaveholders would force box-style fights with European techniques. In the Carolinas and Georgia, rough-and-tumble rules, where biting, gouging, and wrestling were allowed, dominated. The brutality had no standard but cruelty. What's often forgotten is that many of these men had never raised a hand in violence before being forced into it. They were farmers, blacksmiths, fathers, sons. The transformation into fighters was a distortion of who they truly were, a mask placed upon them by a system that saw them as less than human. Among the enslaved community, these fighters were viewed with complex feelings. Some feared them, some pitied them, and some quietly supported them. They were victims, not aggressors. In whispered circles, elders would say prayers for them, women would sneak herbs or food to help them recover, and children would stare at them with wide, confused eyes, not understanding why their friend or uncle had to fight. The enslavers rarely saw any of this. To them, the fighter was property, profitable, entertaining, and replaceable. Some even forced fighters to wear special collars or belts to mark them, like cattle or trophies. Their humanity was never considered. In these moments, strength wasn't just physical. It was emotional resilience, the ability to endure humiliation, pain, and fear. And for many, it was also the ability to hold on to a piece of themselves, to remember who they were before the fights, and who they dreamed of becoming if freedom ever came. By the time an enslaved man was forced into a staged fight, he had already been stripped of so much: his freedom, his family, his identity. Now, even his dignity was placed on the line for the entertainment of those who saw him as a commodity. These fights were not held in secrecy. They were organized, announced, and attended by white onlookers, plantation owners, neighbors, even visiting businessmen, who came to watch, drink, and wager. The fights took place in various settings: open yards behind the plantation house, cleared-out barns, or even makeshift arenas constructed for bigger gatherings. In some southern towns, fights between enslaved men became main events, planned days in advance, with bets placed and food served like at a festival. To the enslavers, it was sport. To the enslaved, it was torment. The rules were cruelly inconsistent. In some fights, it was bare-knuckle to the finish. In others, simple tools, like sticks or weighted gloves, were introduced to escalate the brutality. Some enslavers added restrictions, such as tying one hand or blindfolding one eye, just to increase the spectacle. The goal wasn't victory, it was submission or collapse. For the enslaved fighters, there were no real choices. Refusing to fight meant punishment, whippings, starvation, or isolation. Participating meant pain and degradation, but sometimes, surviving the fight could earn a small favor, extra food, a short reprieve from work, or the safety of their family for another day. These were not rewards, they were manipulations, tactics to bend the will. Among those forced to fight, some developed silent codes with each other. A glance, a softened blow, a feigned fall, ways to resist in the only form they could. Still, even these small acts were dangerous. Overseers were always watching, and any sign of mercy could lead to punishment for both fighters. The physical aftermath of a fight was visible: bruises, swollen limbs, broken bones. But the emotional aftermath cut deeper. Fighters were often isolated, both by their role and by the trauma they carried. Some were feared by other enslaved people, not for what they had done, but for what they had been forced to become. Children were often kept away from the fights, but they still heard the stories, the screams, the rumors, the shame. Elders tried to shield them, offering prayers and lessons to counter the violence with memory and hope. In the hush of night, the enslaved community found quiet ways to tend wounds: salves, songs, silence. Over time, the pain of these fights etched itself into the memory of entire families. Some carried scars, others carried stories. Many chose silence, passing only fragments to the next generation. These fragments became seeds of remembrance, the roots of a history that the enslavers tried to erase but could never truly bury. The enslaved men who fought were not warriors by choice. They were survivors in a system designed to break them. And though they were forced to stand in a ring, their real battle was always against the inhumanity that put them there. The fights were not random acts of cruelty, they were often systematized, with certain enslavers turning them into ritualized events. Some enslaved men were singled out, trained like animals over weeks, not with proper instruction, but through repetitive violence, manipulation, and threats. A stronger or more muscular man might be isolated, fed more than others, but always with a price. These men were coached on how to punch harder, how to take a hit, how to perform pain. Overseers and even other enslaved men were forced to act as mock opponents in grueling sparring sessions that left bruises and broken bones. This wasn't training in any noble sense, it was conditioning through brutality. Some enslaved men, especially those viewed as prize fighters, were kept away from field work entirely, housed separately, their lives controlled around fight schedules. Though they may have received slightly better food or clothing, they lived under constant surveillance and were seen not as people but as assets, flesh investments for gambling profit. Fear was the primary tool of control. Fighters were told that if they lost or disobeyed, their families would suffer. Their children could be sold. Their wives punished. This coercion broke many, but some found hidden strength in protecting others. They endured, hoping to shield those they loved. In some plantations, slave fights were also used as punishment spectacles. An enslaved man who had resisted or spoken out might be thrown into a fight against a stronger opponent, not to entertain but to humiliate. The audience watched with expectation, and the fighter often understood, this wasn't about winning, this was about being broken in public. For those who were forced into these matches, the psychological damage was profound. After each fight, many withdrew emotionally. Some became numb, walking through days in silence. Others grew angry or aggressive, not out of nature, but out of trauma and survival. Yet, amid all this horror, humanity endured. Some enslaved men refused to hit their opponents harder than needed. Others whispered words of support between rounds. Some intentionally fell to avoid causing serious harm. In these small, quiet rebellions, dignity remained. The enslaved communities surrounding these fighters did their best to preserve their spirits. Women would tend to their wounds in secret, older men would offer quiet words of strength. In songs, they buried messages of resistance and sorrow. In prayer, they found space to grieve. Though their bodies were used for sport, their souls could not be owned. Their suffering was deep, but so was their will to survive. These men were made to fight not for glory, but to please those who denied their humanity. But they never stopped being human. As slave fights became more established on certain plantations, they evolved into organized forms of gambling. These were not simply brutal pastimes, they became an industry of suffering, where enslaved lives were commodified for entertainment and monetary gain. Plantation owners and local elites saw opportunity in wagering on the outcomes of staged fights, turning violent exploitation into profit. Fights were scheduled on weekends or after harvest periods, drawing in white spectators from nearby towns. Makeshift arenas were built from wood scraps or cleared fields surrounded by wagons. The enslaved men forced to participate were often paraded beforehand, shown off like prized livestock, while bets were placed based on strength, scars, or previous wins. Bookkeepers, usually white overseers, managed the betting process. They wrote down wagers in ledgers and ensured the winning owner received his earnings. Sometimes, the enslaved fighters were given a small incentive, extra rations, old boots, or a moment of leniency. But this was not kindness, it was control. Their reward was meant to encourage obedience, not honor effort. The fights grew more theatrical. Rules were created, sometimes timed rounds, no weapons, or limits on grappling. But these rules were inconsistently applied, and enforcement depended on the mood of the overseer or the enthusiasm of the crowd. Violence always won in the end. Slave owners boasted about their champions, traveling to nearby plantations to arrange cross-estate matches. These events were even more profitable, drawing larger crowds. Slaveholders saw these exhibitions as a mark of status, as they bragged about the endurance, strength, or discipline of their man. Behind the arrogance was a disturbing pride, one that ignored the humanity of those they claimed to own. Some enslaved people were forced to fight relatives or close friends from other plantations, unaware until the moment of confrontation. The realization would strike mid-fight, faces recognizing each other through pain and sweat. But the show had to go on. Their lives, and their families, hung in the balance. To the white crowd, these events were just entertainment. Cheers rose, laughter echoed, and the pain of others became an afternoon's thrill. Children watched from wagons. Women clapped from the shade. It was a twisted social gathering, blending cruelty with festivity. For the enslaved communities, these events brought deep sorrow. They prayed not for victory, but for safety, for the fight to end without death. Afterward, defeated fighters limped back to the quarters, not only bruised in body, but shattered in spirit. The profits from these fights bought luxury for the owners, finer furniture, imported goods, or new land. Meanwhile, the enslaved bled for pennies they never touched. Their suffering became revenue, their agony someone else's celebration. But even in such darkness, resistance remained. Fighters would sometimes agree in advance to stage a false struggle, to control the pace, to avoid serious harm. These moments of strategy were dangerous but brilliant. It was one of the only ways they could reclaim a sliver of agency in a world built on domination. Slave fights were never only about violence, they were also about control. These brutal events were used by white plantation owners to assert dominance not just over individuals, but over entire communities of enslaved people. Every blow, every forced match, was a message: resistance comes with pain, and your body is not your own. These staged fights became public rituals of power. The entire plantation, and often neighboring ones, were summoned to observe. The enslaved, men, women, and children, were required to stand in rows and watch, silently. Overseers patrolled the crowd to ensure obedience, sometimes with rifles in hand. For the enslaved audience, it was both terrifying and heartbreaking to see their friends, brothers, or husbands thrown into violence. These events also became part of the social calendar for the white elite. Plantation owners, their wives, and even their children would attend, dressed in finery, sipping sweet drinks, chatting under shaded porches. They observed the suffering of others as if it were theater. For them, it was a demonstration of ownership, of civilized control over wild bodies, as they falsely described it. Fights were often arranged during holidays, after harvests, or on Sundays, days when enslaved people were allowed brief moments of rest. But instead of rest, they were made to participate in or witness pain. The timing was deliberate. It reminded them that even their leisure belonged to someone else. The atmosphere during these events was charged with tension. Music sometimes played, violins or drums, usually performed by other enslaved musicians. But the melodies were not joyful. They echoed through the hot air like an eerie signal of what was to come. The fighters, chosen or forced, were paraded before the crowd. Sometimes, they were made to stand on wooden blocks or tables for all to see. Their bodies became a public display, an exhibition of muscle, scars, or discipline. This was humiliation disguised as honor. It was a performance of power for white spectators and a performance of warning for the enslaved. In some cases, the fights were staged to punish dissent. If someone had disobeyed or tried to escape, they might be forced to fight as a form of punishment, not just to hurt them, but to make them an example. Their suffering became propaganda. Children, both white and enslaved, were shaped by these spectacles. White children learned to see domination as normal, even amusing. Enslaved children learned the weight of silence, the pain of fear, and the boundaries they dared not cross. These early lessons stayed with them for life. But within this horror, silent resistance brewed. The enslaved watched closely, not just the fights, but the patterns, the moments when overseers were distracted, the quiet exchanges between fighters. They learned who could be trusted, who might help if an escape was ever possible, who still had spirit left. These fights were meant to break them. But sometimes, they gave the enslaved a terrible clarity, not of submission, but of truth. The truth of their oppression, the truth of their stolen lives, and the truth that one day, somehow, things had to change. Behind every staged fight, beneath the noise and humiliation, there lived a quiet kind of resistance. Though enslaved fighters were pushed into violence for others' entertainment, many of them refused to let that be the full story. They found ways to reclaim their dignity, not by escaping the arena, but by showing control over their own spirit. Some fighters learned to hold back their full strength. They would spar without truly injuring their opponent, sending silent signals through feints, glances, or softened strikes. These were dangerous acts of rebellion. If overseers noticed, punishment would be severe. But when it worked, two enslaved men could protect each other even in forced battle. This cooperation became an act of defiance, small, but brave. Others turned their bodies into symbols of endurance. By refusing to scream, by refusing to collapse, they held on to something that couldn't be whipped away: pride. Their pain was not weakness, but a message: they were still human. Even while forced to fight, they chose how to carry themselves, how to be seen. Some even managed to use the moment for something more. A whispered message during a clinch. A coded nod seen by someone in the crowd. A gesture that reached loved ones who were watching. In a place designed to strip away identity, the enslaved found fragments of connection. There were also those who refused altogether. A few, despite knowing the consequences, would not fight. These rare moments often ended in brutal punishment or worse. But they were remembered. In whispered stories shared at night, those who resisted became quiet legends, proof that not everyone bowed. These choices were not about winning. There was no victory in the ring. They were about agency, about carving out the smallest possible space of choice in a world that offered none. Women also showed silent resistance. Though not fighters in the ring, they were sometimes made to assist, nursing wounds, preparing food, or cleaning up after the events. Some secretly tended to injured fighters with more care than allowed. Others spread stories or warnings, helped hide weapons, or offered small comforts. Their role in the chain of quiet rebellion was essential. Children, too, learned from these moments. They saw what strength looked like, not brute force, but emotional endurance. Many grew up remembering fighters who nodded rather than wept, who stood rather than begged. These memories became fuel for future resistance. The pain was real. The blood, the bruises, the fear, it all scarred deeply. But what remained stronger than scars was memory. And that memory kept growing, passed from voice to voice, night to night. Memory became the seed of hope. Even when silence was required, even when submission was enforced, the enslaved found ways to show the truth: they were not broken. They were watching. They were thinking. And they would remember. Long after the brutal practice of staged slave fights faded, the memory of those forced into them remained. The fighters were never given medals. They weren't remembered in official histories. But in the hearts of their descendants, their pain, and quiet courage, echoed across generations. In the post-emancipation years, stories of these forced battles were passed down in whispers. Families would speak of uncles or great-grandfathers who had been made to fight. Not as shameful secrets, but as part of the truth. A truth that revealed the cruelty of the system, but also the endurance of the enslaved. Some communities began to reclaim the narrative. Rather than letting it remain a story of humiliation, they told it as one of survival. Not about the violence, but about what those men and women held on to: their dignity, their resistance, their humanity. Churches, families, and local gatherings became places where these stories were honored. Artists began to paint them. Writers turned their lives into fiction, then into history. Museums began to include accounts of staged fights among the broader story of slavery in America. It became clear, this was not spectacle, it was suffering. And it deserved to be remembered honestly. In certain towns, descendants gathered in remembrance. Not to glorify the fights, but to remember those forced into them. Names that were once forgotten were written into memorials, sometimes on stones, sometimes in songs. There was power in finally saying their names aloud. These memories also inspired modern movements. Activists fighting against systemic violence, injustice, and racial exploitation today draw strength from these stories. They look at what those enslaved men endured, and how they carried themselves, and find the roots of resistance. The arenas are gone now. The overseers, the crowds, the bets, they're all part of a painful past. But the people who stood within those rings, their strength still lives. They didn't fight by choice, but they survived by will. And that survival became a legacy. Not just for African Americans, but for the world to learn from. Their stories call on us all to look deeper, beyond violence, beyond silence, and ask, what does it mean to resist with nothing but your presence? To protect dignity in a place designed to erase it? Their answer came not through words, but through actions under pressure, choices made in fear, and the quiet endurance of the human spirit. They should never have had to fight. But since they did, we must never forget them.